So allow me to first introduce Bernd Werse from the Goethe University, Heine already mentioned. Bernd is a senior researcher at the Center for Drug Research of Goethe University in Frankfurt since 2002. He has been involved in numerous social scientific drug-related research projects, including the local drug monitoring system, MOSID, new psychoactive substances, small-scale drug dealing, cannabis cultivation, open drug scenes, drugs and urban security. And he's currently researching the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on drug services and people who use drugs heavily. Bernd is also the co-editor of the German Alternative Report on Drugs and Addiction, board member of the European Society for Social Drug Research, International Journal of Drug Policy, in Drugs and Alcohol Today journal. He's also the editor of the Kriminologisches Journal and speaker of the German Drug Policy Network, Schildere Kreis. Bernd will be talking today about, he'll give us an overview on NPS in Germany and Europe and its effects on the substances. Please, Bernd, are you able to share your screen with us?
Yes, I am. Okay, just a second. So thanks, Aisel, for this introduction. Perhaps a few words about how me and my colleagues got contact with that issue back in 2008 when the spice phenomenon came up in German media. We decided to include questions on that in our annual school survey, and so we were the first in Germany to get any epidemiological data on that NPS use, which was a starting point for several projects on NPS, including several EU projects where also other countries were involved. And so since that time, we are following the phenomenon, at least to some degree in Germany and also in Europe. So yeah, I just mentioned that so-called spice phenomenon. That was quite a starting point for NPS in Germany. This is one example of a newspaper article from that time in 2008. The headline here says, "Organic drug allures young students." So at that time, most of the people didn't know, or no one knew what was inside of this stuff that was sold in so-called head shops, and some people thought it was just the effects of the herbs that were inside of this stuff. It was sold legally, but it the effects were similar to cannabis, so many people tried this and realized that it was quite similar to what can be expected from cannabis. There was a big public discussion about this mysterious so-called herbal blend, and a big media hype. Every major media outlet were reporting about that, and everyone was asking what's the secret of this stuff. Then in end 2008, there were two German labs who found synthetic substances in spice that were responsible for the effects of that stuff. And also the Federal Drug Commissioner realized that there is no special secret, but it's just a synthetic substance. And they almost immediately banned these substances. But afterwards, a wave of other cannabinoids and also other herbal blends with other names was setting in. And a little bit later, also other synthetic drugs came on the market, which were all legal at that time. And the German state was quite, it took some time until these substances could be banned. And so some kind of cat and mouse game set in, that new substances came on the market and then a few months later they were banned, etc. And the same was true for many other European countries at that time. So this is an overview that I think most of the people who are doing NPS presentations in Europe are using. The development of newly detected NPS in the European Union, which is provided by the EMCDDA, the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction. And quite important here is the graph on the right-hand side with the yellow stuff here, where you can see that in 2014 the number of newly detected NPS was at the peak of over 100. So and you can also see that around that time when the spice phenomenon started in 2008, 2009, the number started to increase rapidly. After that peak in 2014, it went down again, but we're still at, I have to, I can see it right now, but we're still at more than 40 substances per year who are newly detected in the European Union, and we're at a total of 830 substances that were detected newly in the European Union since 2005. This graph on the left-hand side, there you can see that most or that the largest number of single substance classes were the cannabinoids with 209, followed by cathinones, also other substances, but and phenethylamines, etc. I won't go into detail of all these substances because I will do that later. But this is just to have an impression what was going on in the last 15, 16 years with new substances on the market. I must have to point out that not all of these substances were really relevant. Not all of these substances were really relevant. Many substances just disappeared after they appeared newly on the market, but there were many others who stayed there, but or just disappeared when they were banned in the most countries, and then new substances came up. Here we are. So a few words about this synthetic cannabinoid or herbal blend stuff. Synthetic cannabinoids or cannabimimetics, because they are not really in the chemical sense, they are not really cannabinoids, but substances that mimic the effects of cannabinoids, of the active substances in cannabis. They are the most prevalent category of NPS. Mostly they are sold as so-called herbal blends. So this hasn't changed since the time of the spice phenomenon. Non-psychoactive herbs laced with synthetic cannabinoids. Mainly in the early days of the phenomenon, the effects were similar to cannabis. Then later, when all the time new substances came up, some users experienced much more severe effects and also effects that were not very much similar to cannabis, particularly when they were taking high doses. One special risk of these substances is also that different from cannabis or from THC, really severe physical effects can occur when you are overdosing on that. There are even cases when people have died just because of the use of one use of these substances. It's usually smoked like cannabis, often also used as substitute for cannabis. And these substances can also be bought as pure substance, but many of these substances are active in quite low doses. And here are some names that are examples of these substances. They often have really complicated combinations of letters and numbers, like 5-F AKB48 or MDMB Fubinaca or stuff like that. Some examples of other important classes of NPS. The first one being cathinones and other phenethylamines. This is the class where amphetamine is kind of the model substance. And so these substances are mostly similar in its effect also to amphetamine or to MDMA, which is also called ecstasy. In the early days of the NPS phenomenon, they were also often sold as something else, like the synthetic cannabinoids were sold as herbal blends. They were called bath salts by the vendors, but this phenomenon is not very much relevant anymore. Mostly they are sold as the substance on the package, there's the number of the name of the substance. One other important class which came up in more recently are opioids, so synthetic derivatives of morphine, heroin, etc., including very potent forms like fentanyl derivatives. It's a newer phenomenon, and it's also very much relevant in the US opioid crisis. So there are currently many people dying from overdoses of fentanyl derivatives. Then another class are the tryptamines. These are psychedelics that are similar to the mushroom substance psilocybin, or also DMT. NPS versions are called, for instance, 4-HOMET or DPT. So there were also quite many of them detected in the last years. Then we also have benzodiazepines. These are derivatives of very common medical sedatives like diazepam or Xanax or alprazolam. Also for these quite common but also quite addictive medical sedatives, we have a wide range of NPS alternatives now on the market. Which was also quite a recent phenomenon, particularly in Germany and other European states, where LSD derivatives like 1P LSD or L-LAT, they have quite strong psychedelic effects, quite similar to LSD, and they are often used by the so-called psychonauts, and I will tell a little bit more about this group later. Some words about the effects of NPS. As most of these NPS are derivatives of classic illicit drugs or psychoactive medical drugs, the effects are also mostly similar to these substances, but every substance has its own range of effects, including the strength. So unintended overdoses up to life-threatening ones are likely. So you have to know what could be the active substance, which can really differ heavily. For instance, some NPS, I have written here examples like the so-called NBOME psychedelics or fentanyl derivatives. They have active doses in the microgram range, so really low amounts of these substances can cause severe effects or maybe even fatal when you're not sure about the amount. Some other substances have much higher active doses, so it's important if someone wants to use these substances, very important how much of these substances he or she will use of it. Regarding the synthetic cannabinoids, while early synthetic cannabinoids were reported to actually have effects similar to cannabis, users reported effects to be different in more recent synthetic cannabinoids, particularly regarding the psychological effects like anxiety symptoms in high doses or stuff like that. So here one single example of one of the most popular NPS substances, but it was popular back in like 10 years ago. This substance is called Mettadrone. It's a cathinone derivative. Since late 2008, the drug became very popular in the UK, also in some other countries, but mainly in the UK. It was then sold legally at kiosks or other outlets. Effects were reported as somewhere between MDMA, cocaine, and amphetamine, but a little bit different from that. They were particularly used at techno parties, and the popularity was also fueled by a shortage of MDMA at that time. So there was not very much real ecstasy available. So many people from this techno party spectrum switched to this drug. Some users developed problems up to dependence, and it was then banned in mid-2010 in the UK and also many other European countries. And but it took some years until it lost its significance. It didn't immediately disappear after the ban, but it was sold illegally, and still it's sold illegally, but not in an amount that it was sold back in these days. So some special features of the NPS phenomenon. The first one, it would have been unimaginable without the internet. So from the internet, you get information, and there are also many online shops on the internet worldwide in a rapidly changing market. Also, these shops are adapting to new laws in the countries that are banning substances. This is related to the second point here. There are diverging legal regulation in EU countries. Some of these countries have introduced blanket bans banning really barely any psychoactive substance. Some have outlawed relatively few. So there are differences between countries. The prohibition laws in different countries often do not cover new substances, so there is a steady rise of new substances. For instance, in Germany, until 2016, new single substances were controlled in the narcotics law, so they have to include them every year, these single substances. But then an NPS law, the so-called NPSG, was introduced, which was banning complete classes of psychoactive substances, including new substances that were not detected yet. Several times, this law was revised for new classes or substances outside the definitions, and I think it's also happening in a few weeks that a new revision of this law will be introduced. But I have to point out that in European, when you see at the whole of European countries, the level of repression on NPS does not necessarily go along with levels of use. And we can see it in this map here. But first of all, a little bit of overview, how many people generally use NPS in Europe. When we see here on the left side, these are the percentages for all adults from 15 to 64 years in the European Union, and we can see here that on average, regarding all adults, on average, 0.6% have used one or more NPS in the last year. When we look at the young adults, these are 1.1%. But we can also see here that there's quite a wide range between countries. So the country with the lowest prevalence rate has 0.1% among the young adults, and the one with the highest percentage has 3.2%. But still, this is not so much when we compare it with cannabis, for instance, where we have 15% on average in this age group, and relatively similar, but still lower than cocaine with 2.1% and MDMA with 1.9%. When we look at school children, 15 to 16-year-olds in 22 EU countries, coming from the European School Survey, we see here that in 2019, the last year prevalence rate was a little bit higher than for the young adults, with 2.4%, and also the range between countries was higher, between 0.6 and 4.9%. So we can see that NPS prevalence is quite similar to cocaine or MDMA prevalence, but much lower than cannabis prevalence. And we can also see here, when we look at the survey in 2015, that NPS prevalence rates have dropped since then, from 3.8 to 2.4%. Okay, if we look at that map here, we can see there are considerable differences between countries. There are some countries, for example, in the north of Europe or in the west of Europe, where they have quite low prevalence rates among young people. And there are some countries here in the central eastern part of Europe, particularly, where they have quite high prevalence rates. And I have to point out that many of these countries have relatively repressive laws on NPS, but they also have quite repressive laws on illicit substances. So that might be a reason why many of these young people switch to new psychoactive substances. So some numbers about, or some words about NPS use in Germany, according to the so-called epidemiological survey of substance abuse, which concerns all adults. We also have quite a similar or a relatively low last year prevalence of 0.9% compared to other European countries. In a survey of adolescents and young adults, this rate was even lower. The last one being in 2019. I also have to say that the prevalence of these substances is hard to detect in surveys generally. Particularly young people often don't know exactly what they have used. Some confuse it with medical drugs, with cannabis, with other illicit drugs, or even legal substances. They say, well, I have tried some electronic cigarette, and they sorted it somehow into new psychoactive substances, for instance. So it's can be quite hard to ask questions about how. Can someone? Okay. Now this microphone is muted. Thanks. Generally, we can say, compared to other European countries, NPS prevalence in Germany is relatively low. So finally, some evidence from non-representative surveys that we were doing in Germany, mostly we were doing in Germany and also other European countries. We did that quite early in Germany in 2011 and 2013, and we participated in a EU project with 5 other countries in 2016. When we look at the distribution of NPS use or NPS prevalence in Germany, we have pronounced regional differences. The higher the repression, the higher the prevalence of NPS. So when we were doing our online surveys, we have a massive overrepresentation of Bavaria, which is known as the most repressive state or federal state in Germany when it comes to drug policy. So there were quite many people switching to these drugs who were afraid of law enforcement. At least until 2014, synthetic cannabinoids were the most important class of NPS in Germany, which is quite similar to most of the other countries. And we detected several types of NPS users. the first one being mere experimenters. So this is always the biggest group among people who are trying drugs, who try once or a few times. But among the regular users, the two most important groups were the one that we called potheads 2.0, which were regular cannabis users who temporarily switched to synthetic cannabinoids. And the other one called psychonauts or cyber because they are communicating mainly via the internet. People who are highly interested in diverse psychoactive experiences and who are interested in trying many different psychoactive substances. Over time, when we look at these different online surveys, we could observe some shift from these so-called potheads 2.0 to more psychonauts. Also regarding the substances, a switch from more synthetic cannabinoids to more psychedelics. And this was mainly coming from this survey that we did in the EU project, which included these 6 countries, Hungary, Ireland, the Netherlands, Poland, and Portugal, and Germany. Just a few words about the differences in patterns of use and user types across these countries. When we look at Hungary, to some degree also Ireland, we saw synthetic cannabinoid use mainly among marginalized populations. So this was also a move that could be observed in the last years. In the Netherlands, the use was mainly restricted to the then legal stimulant for fluoramphetamine in party settings. We could observe barely any synthetic cannabinoid use, which was clearly due to the fact that that cannabis is in the Netherlands factually legal. In Germany and Portugal, we had psychedelics as the most prevalent NPS use. So we also had a dominance of psychonaut users. And Poland was the only country which has quite a repressive drug policy. It was the only country that had significant NPS user populations among nightlife party drug users, marginalized users, but also other people who are using at home and were reached online in our surveys. And then one again here, we could observe a general shift of synthetic cannabinoid use more to marginalized people who use drugs, also regarding prisons. I think we will have a presentation about that later, yes, from Volker, who was also, who was part in other EU projects we participated in. So a few words about the about discussion of these results. While the popularity of NPS in Europe grew with media hypes around 2008 and 2009, the phenomenon continued even in countries which introduced very repressive bans on these substances. The effects of these substances mostly resemble those of the original illicit drugs, but with remarkable differences concerning dosage and intensity of effects. So we have a really wide range of any psychoactive substances here in the NPS range. As a tendency, the risks of NPS are higher than those of illicit drugs. But for instance, due to the huge number of substances with different dosages and side effects, so the unpredictability of the effects sometimes. Compared to other drugs, NPS prevalence is low, but it differs heavily across countries. And in recent years, NPS use somewhat shifted from mere experimental users and substitutors, so people who substituting their cannabis use with cannabinoids, to more marginalized groups, and also on the other hand, psychonauts, so very experimental drug users. Okay. So much from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernd. It's very interesting, really, also very multidimensional. we have a few minutes left. There's about 7 minutes left for some questions and to maybe have a comment or two. I would like to just say a few words about Bernd's presentation. For me, at least, is very catchy. The new terminology that you introduced, the psychonauts and cyber psychonauts, if have not heard about these before, but I think these are also kind of a way or a sort of a reflection of the developments of the, you know, darknet, online drug markets, and the NPS and communication platforms and all of that. So I think it opens a lot of interesting points about how the terminology also reflects the way people take drugs and call themselves or use different labels. Are there any questions, any interesting comments, anything that you would like to open now? You can raise the hand on Zoom or just unmute yourself.
Perhaps that was just too much information at once.
I know he's clapping, but do you have a question?
Thank you.
Well, if I may ask a question, Bernd.
Of course.
What is your impression for the future? Will there be a growing market, or how do you assess the developments, first of all in Germany and then in Europe?
Well, when we look at Germany, I mean, as I mentioned, it's really hard to ask about NPS use in surveys. So it's still a little bit difficult because when, for instance, for this survey for adult users, in the first survey, when they asked for that, I think like 10 years ago, they were asking different questions than they did years later. So because they had to, you know, it's hard to handle this subject. But given all information that we have, it looks more like use has slightly going down in the last years, because most of the people who wanted to try these substances have tried it, and most, for instance, most of the cannabis users who tried synthetic cannabinoid realized that that's not better, but it's more dangerous, and they wanted to stick to the original substance. And the same is true for many people who are used to party drugs like ecstasy or amphetamine. Usually they get what they want, and they don't have to buy some other substances that are where they don't know exactly how the effects could be and how the risks could be. And so this might be a reason for this slight decrease, which we can also observe in many other European countries. But we could also see that the use was going more into marginalized populations like prison populations, but also in some countries populations of marginalized drug users who usually use heroin and crack cocaine and stuff like that. But that also differs heavily in terms of regions. For instance, in Germany and in the Munich open drug scene, we have a considerable amount of NPS, of cathinone use. In Frankfurt, in comparison, there were barely any people who use these substances. So it depends also on policies and how people or how states are handling that issue.
What do you think is the strongest link with regards to the development of the NPS use? Is it the media hype you mentioned, or is it the fact of prohibition and the strategy of substituting drugs? What is the stronger effect?
In the beginning, it was clearly the media hype. Back in these days, we were interviewing also people who sold these drugs in the so-called head shops when it was legal, and they said there were people coming in that we didn't ever see here in a shop for cannabis users. People who older people like 40, 50 years old who had experiences with cannabis, and and they said, well, I saw there's a new drug, I wanted to try it, but they never came back again. So most of these people tried it, and then that's it. But that was only in the beginning of that phenomenon. And I think when it continued later, it was more like, you know, for instance, for these marginalized group, an important factor is that synthetic cannabinoids are really cheap when you buy it as pure substance. So, for instance, in the Budapest open drug scene, it's a very big issue, and they have very repressive drug policies there, which makes it difficult to get other drugs. But obviously, it's much easier to get these cannabinoids.
Thanks so much, Bernd. I think the topic actually requires so much more questions. I'm just reminded of the time. I will read one comment from Daniela Forlano. She's just commented that she agrees, and she's a social worker from Italy, a local addiction unit of NHS. And she's saying that some of our patients reported that synthetic cannabinoids are too strong and they didn't appreciate the effect they turned back to natural cannabinoids. I think this is a pretty interesting observation from daily practice. Thanks again. I'm sure we'll come back to questions at the end when we have a bit of time left for general discussions and so on.